Welcome to another random video by your friend Matthew. I have this very exciting cacti shirt that my girlfriend gave me for my birthday. My birthday was May 5th. I turned 35 years old. Pretty weird, pretty crazy. You know, I don't feel old. 35 is not old, but 35, that number sounds older than me in some way. Even though, really, I am infinitely old. And I'll talk about why on this video. So, this YouTube channel here that I have a few different projects going on. Number one, I have a podcast where I talk to people about their spirituality. The podcast is called the Infinite Weird Podcast. And I dialogue with people about their relationship with spirituality. And some people that I talk to don't even like the word spiritual. They don't consider themselves spiritual people. And that's totally cool. That's totally fine. And I want to talk to people like that. I want to talk to people across the spectrum. The spectrum of spirituality and the lack thereof. So it's been very fun. Go check out those videos if you're interested. The most recent one was with a guy named Alex Nimzer, who is brilliant and funny and insightful and wise. He's also got a video called God's Eyebrows, which is this like poetic monologue, this rewriting of an Old Testament story. He has a whole book, in fact. He published a book that is tons and tons and tons of different retellings of Abraham and Isaac from the Old Testament. Very cool dude. Go check that out. That was one of my favorite episodes I've done so far. Otherwise on this channel, I make videos like this where I talk about topics related to spirituality and philosophy and topics that I am exploring in the book that I'm writing, that I have been writing for several months and I will be writing for several months more. Super excited about the book. I've talked about it on previous videos. Don't want to go into it right now. So, I also have videos on this channel about tarot, specifically the major arcana in the tarot cards in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck specifically. That's the deck that I'm using to talk about tarot, to talk about archetypes, to talk about symbolism, to talk about the existential, significance of the cards. So I have several different little branches happening right here on this channel, and it's been a good time. So lately I've been making videos, in the vein of the philosophy, spirituality stuff, mainly just making videos on like pairings, kind of. I've done one on pantheism and panentheism, did one on being and becoming, did one on soul and spirit, interdependence and emptiness, right? And today I want to talk about the infinite and the finite. Now, a lot of these topics I talk about obviously have overlaps, and in some ways they're kind of different ways to talk about the same thing, right? It's like when writers talk about all their books are like going to the same mountaintop. It's like different trails to the same mountaintop. Now, that's not to say that it's not to say that it's always literally the same mountaintop. Maybe it is, but I know that there's a danger to say, oh, well, all the spiritual traditions are just saying the exact same thing. That's a complicated statement. I think that there are tons of differences, and there are similarities, usually, especially in, mysticism. The mystics of each spiritual tradition or religious tradition often have a lot in common with mystics from other traditions. And some might say that the mystics from one tradition have less in common with the non-mystics of their own tradition than with mystics of another tradition. Does that make sense? Because we can go into this more deeply in another video, but mystics often are trying to, one reason maybe that they have so much in common is that the mystics are trying to view and experience God, the God beyond God, kind of, or like the unnameable, that which cannot be named. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao, right? So the mystics seem to realize this in different spiritual traditions, that like the divine is nameless, formless, kind of, or incomprehensible or ineffable, and if regardless of what their tradition is, if they have that sensibility, then of course they're going to have a lot in common with a person from another tradition who in a lot of ways sees the divine in a similar way. And then so that's kind of the esoteric thread of spirituality, and then the exoteric is kind of the outward expressions of that tradition, and there are some beautiful exoteric elements to certain religious traditions, and there are, unfortunate and unhealthy aspects of certain exoteric traditions. And, maybe I'll make a video on esoteric and exoteric. That actually sounds really fun. So let's save that for another time. Today I want to talk about the infinite and the finite, right? So I've been thinking about infinity a lot for the last couple of years, It's like, and it's a topic that has been talked about for thousands of years. And, in pre-Socratic Greek philosophy, you got this guy named Anaximander, right? There are a lot of interesting ancient Greek philosophers, obviously. Anaximander, though, he is known, if I'm not mistaken, as the first, or one of the first, people to write down kind of a philosophical, write down philosophical texts. And in the context of infinity, though, it's like at the time, pre-Socratic Greek philosophy was often trying to say, well, what is the fundamental factor or element or irreducible component of the universe or reality itself? And you had a lot of Greek philosophers having different theories about that, right? You can look into it. It's interesting. There's a lot of different philosophers at that time had different theories about what was the irreducible reality or irreducible component to the universe and reality. Well, Anaximander had my favorite theory of all those Greek philosophers, and his theory was that the irreducible most fundamental reality in the universe is infinity. He called it I don't know how to pronounce it. I should have looked that up before I made this video. Apeiron or Apeiron. It's Apeiron. That was his name for infinity. Infinity as fundamental reality. And so, that when I read that I had already kind of had that view in some ways. And so I was like, nice. Anaximander, yes, I feel you. And so, and obviously Aristotle talked about infinity. Greg Cantor, Is that his name? The mathematician that was obsessed with infinity? There's a lot of mathematicians and a lot of scientists who have tried to address and explore infinity. Well, for me, when I think about kind of that whole fundamental reality view of infinity, I think about how it seems like the universe and reality itself is manifested out of an infinite surplus of life and energy and manifestation, right? An infinite surplus of potential. Maybe I should say that. It seems like reality itself is manifested out of an infinite surplus of potential. And so infinity, I guess we could see infinity in a lot of ways, right? We could see infinity as the infinite potential, the infinite potential that reality manifests out of, because it never stops manifesting, right? Reality never stops manifesting. And so that surplus is seemingly infinite because it's always there. Being itself, in my view, is beginningless and endless and timeless, and therefore infinite. And so I guess, usually we say eternal for the time that, like beyond time or timeless, the eternal. And then infinite is, I guess, usually attributed to space, whereas eternity is attributed to time. So infinity is like usually in the context of space, infinite space or something. And so when I talk about it, it's not locked to those things. But so reality itself is manifested out of an infinite surplus of potential. And so that's one way we could see infinity. And, related to that, this notion of like the unmanifest, right? In the Vedanta tradition, Brahman is, Brahman, not I-N. Brahman, I-N, is like a priest, the priest figure in the priest class, but Brahman, A-N, is basically the term used in the Upanishads for ultimate reality. And you could even say infinity, or you could say the unmanifest, right? Like the formless, the that which has no dimensions, no dimensions, ultimately no form, infinite potential that is always manifesting itself into the world of form, always manifesting itself into the world of form. So we could see infinity like that. We could also see infinity as just the interdependent web of all existing things that, you could maybe argue that technically it's not infinite, that there are a finite number of forms in the universe, but essentially infinite, right? I mean, there's no way we could ever even begin to be aware of the seemingly infinite number of forms in the universe. So yeah, we could kind of see infinity as, the unmanifest and the manifested world. Okay, so that's one thing. And so let's talk about the finite, right? Those are some ways to think about infinity. And so the finite is obviously forms, right? I mean, each form that we know of is finite, ultimately, right? Even the sun, the earth, our bodies, my phone, this notebook. All forms are finite. They have an expiration date. They decay. So what's interesting is because infinity has infinite potential and an infinite surplus, then it just continues to create an endless number of forms out of its own infinity, out of its own infinite potential. And so this notion that has been spoken of in a lot of spiritual traditions, of basically the infinite creating the finite forms in order to almost forget itself, like to forget its own infinity, right? Infinity creates these finite forms and forgets its own infinity because as those finite forms, it is not, each finite form is not infinite in its form self, right? It's finite as a form. And so infinity has to kind of forget its infinitude to create finite forms. And the finite forms themselves, let's take a person for an example. Like I, as a person, my body, my physical form is finite, but it is an expression of, or a manifestation of, or ultimately no different from infinity itself. And so a human being has an interesting predicament of being in a finite form, in a world of finite forms, but I can sit here and talk about infinity. I can think about, I can at least point my mind in the direction of the ineffable. And I can even uncover the ineffable within myself. And that's pretty wild, right? That's pretty wild that we can do that as human beings. So that's kind of the main thrust that I think about with infinity and the finite, is just this weird kind of paradox or tension between the reality of infinity and the reality of finite forms, such as our bodies and brains. And I think that, if infinity in its infinitude has the tendency or the drive or the pull to create finite forms and pretend that it's finite through these forms, then there's something beautiful. Okay, there's something beautiful about the finite world, right? There's something beautiful about the finite world. If reality was just infinite potential without the finite world of forms, then I don't know what it would look like. I have no clue what that would be or what that would look like. But our finite lives and the world of finite forms, it it produces suffering, but it also produces beauty, and it produces love, and it produces compassion and awakening, right? Like Maya, from a more tantric perspective, Maya is no longer seen as a Maya begins to look like grace, right? I read something recently that was saying that Maya is like a form of grace, and Maya as the veil, basically, the veil of separateness, the illusion of separateness, the illusion that because we live in this world of infinite, a world of finite forms, that somehow we and those finite forms are not infinity. They are. And so as a human being, we have this veil where we forget, or we don't realize, we don't recognize, we don't acknowledge that everything is an expression of infinity. We don't acknowledge that. And that's the veil, that's Maya. But we can unveil that. We can unveil that reality. And that's why Maya is grace, because if we didn't have that veil, if we didn't have Maya, then we wouldn't have awakening. If we didn't have the veil, then we wouldn't have the unveiling or the revealing. So we could say that in some ways is like a form of grace or something. And I'm sorry that there were moments in this video that might have been too abstract. I hope that it made sense. I mean, we're talking about infinity here, so it's hard to make full sense, because, it's probably one of the hardest things to talk about. But for a long time, I have felt in my own direct experience this seemingly infinite surplus of energy, love, wisdom, and power that I can untap. And it's not mine. It's not, I didn't create it. I have it within me, just like you do. And it's so easy to distort that and blur that and put stuff on top of that and just keep it covered, to keep it covered up. But we can also continuously get like a second wind, right? It's like if we feel unmotivated and lazy and insecure and not smart and not on top of it or whatever, that's just human to feel that way sometimes, for sure. But if we can just remember that we have infinite capability to do what we need to do in any given moment, to handle that moment as skillfully as possible, then we have everything we need. I mean, obviously, that's a tricky statement, because I'm not saying that you automatically have everything you need in a material way, and there are obviously forms of inequality and oppression and lack and poverty and corrupt social systems in the world that prevent people from having what they should have as their own birthright. And so I never want to not acknowledge that, and I never want to act like that's not there. So I'm not saying that those things don't exist, and I'm not saying that I think that those things need to be addressed, and collectively I hope that more and more people can be more and more sensitive to other people's suffering and can fight to amplify wellness and reduce suffering in the world. And I want to continue to find ways to contribute, even in the tiniest possible ways, to that. And I could definitely do more, and I want to do more. And so I do, though, despite all of that, I do believe that people have more wisdom inherent within themselves, and more intelligence inherent within themselves, and more love inherent within themselves than they usually assume, than a lot of people usually assume. And so that's one practical application of infinity to me. Maybe that sounds weird, but I feel that way. I feel like when I honor and acknowledge like infinity within myself, that I, just like you, are manifested out of an infinite surplus of potential, and are, fueled by the same fuel that powers the entire cosmos. That feels empowering. That feels liberating and inspiring and encouraging. So, leave any comments if you have anything to say about this. If you think I'm crazy, if you think I don't make any sense, you can tell me that. That's okay. I'm working to be more clear. I'm working to make more sense. And I appreciate you being on this journey with me. Peace.